Yep. Do we have sound? Good. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this session 3, Empowering Arctic Citizens for Involvement in Decision Making, and part 1, Governance, Justice and Decision Making. So we have in this session 4 presentations. Unfortunately, because of the Arctic conditions, 2 of them didn't make it here, so they will be digitally today, but it's okay. So we have Sigrid, who will first present digitally. She is from Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. And then we have Gerbel, who is also stuck in Oslo. She is from University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Austria. And then we have Anita Parvo from Fulbright Association, and then Helge from Norse. So it's tight time schedule. We have 10 minutes for each presentation, but then lots of time for discussions. So there will be a panel afterwards where you can ask any questions. And if there are no questions, then I should ask questions. And I should be very good in thinking of good questions. But I hope you will all help me with that. So are we ready for Sigrid's presentation? We have her online, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Sigrid Engen. I am a researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. And today I'm going to present some work that we're doing in the Coast Shift project, which is funded by the Fram Center here in Tromsø. And where we're looking into the perceptions of justice, environmental justice, among key actors involved in the use of the coastal zone. Just a little background on the environmental justice concept. So environmental justice arose in the late 1960s, early 70s in the United States, when civil rights movements sounded the alarm about public health dangers for communities of color due to exposure to pollution and waste. And their claims were rooted in unjust distribution, civil rights, and racism. And studies later backed up or found grounds for their claims because they found correlations between toxic waste sites, race, and economy. And since then, distributional justice has been central within environmental justice thinking. But then the concept has evolved into multiple dimensions. And because we have found that environmental justice movements have made claims rooted not only in justice as distribution, but also in procedural justice and in recognitional justice. So just to summarize, we have justice as a multidimensional concept where recognition, procedure, and distribution are the key dimensions. So recognition refers to the rights and the culture and the knowledge of stakeholders are recognized. Procedure refers to decisions that are based on principles of good governance, and distribution relates to decision-making that is mindful of the distribution of benefits and disadvantages. And the blue justice concept has been defined as a just and inclusive blue economy where recognitional, procedural, and distributional justice concerns are at the forefront of the blue growth agenda. Our work with this Blue Justice Survey instrument actually originated through some stakeholder involvement that we did all the way back in 2019, where we traveled along the coast of northern Norway and we talked to stakeholders about sustainability, and the involvement of fishers in decision making was highlighted as a key sustainability challenge. So that's how it all started. And in 2021, we surveyed coastal planners and fishers, asked specifically about procedural justice, whether decisions about the use of the coastal zone the last 5 years have followed principles of good governance. We asked about recognitional justice, whether fishers' knowledge, culture, and rights have been recognized in decisions about the use of the coastal zone the last 5 years. And we asked about distributional justice, whether changes in the use of the coastal zone the last 5 years have impacted local fisheries. We had quite a good response rate. 705 fishers responded to our survey and 41 coastal planners. Key results indicate that there is quite a big difference between the evaluation of justice for local fisheries and local fishers in the use of the coastal zone and coastal zone planning between coastal planners and fishers, where coastal planners generally have a more favorable evaluation than fishers. We also found that we also asked about key challenges for local fisheries so we asked fishers and planners to say something about the key challenges for local fisheries. And what came out of that question was that competition for space and resources surfaced as a very, very big challenge for many people. But first to the responses related to the justice questions. So here you can see the answers, the distribution of answers for recognitional justice. And you can see that there is a big difference between coastal planners and fishers so coastal planners, they say that the recognition of fishers or the use of fishers' knowledge and the recognition of fishers' culture and fishers' rights, or Sea Sami rights to be specific, has been good, or that has been taken into account. Fishers' knowledge and the culture and rights have been recognized to a large or a very large degree, whereas fishers don't share that same view, and we have very few fishers that actually answer to a large or a very large degree, which is indicated by this blue-green area. For procedure, you can see that there's similarly very big difference between planners and fishers. And here in this, for procedure, we asked about the opportunities to participate, fishers' opportunities to participate in coastal zone planning. We asked about accountability, whether or not fishers have known who to contact when conflicts have arisen. We asked about fishers' influence, whether fishers have had influence in decisions about the use of the coastal zone. We asked about access to justice and conflict resolution mechanisms. We asked about trust between fishers and those in charge of making decisions in the use of the coastal zone. And we asked about fairness, their overall assessment of the procedure, whether or not they consider that to be good. And you can see that planners have a much more favorable evaluation. Again, the blue-green area that says that fishers have been involved and participated and had influence to a large or a very large degree, whereas fishers, there's very little of this blue-green area when it comes to fishers. So the fishers mostly respond that fishers have had the opportunity to participate to a small or a very small degree. And for distribution, we can also see that there is a big difference between fishers and planners. These questions have been reversed. So these questions refer to negative impact. So whether changes in the use of the coastal zone have negatively impacted marine resource abundance, important for fisheries, physical access to fishing sites, important habitat for fisheries, fishers' livelihoods, the fish or shellfish quality, fishing effort and fishers' income. And again, you can see that fishers respond that changes in the use of the coastal zone have negatively impacted all of these to a large or a very large degree. Many fishers report that, whereas very few planners report that. And in contrast, planners report that they don't necessarily know how big the negative impact has been, which is important to take. It's an important takeaway message from this. Yeah. Then finally, we asked about the greatest challenges for fisheries in your municipality, and you can see that out of the 360 fishers who replied to this question, competition for space and resources is really mentioned by 64%, so a lot of them. Infrastructure comes second with over 40%. Economy comes third with a little bit over 30%, and the workforce comes fourth with 30% approximately. And if we go deeper into these bars and what they actually show, you can see that for competition for space and resources, aquaculture is mentioned a lot, and also the competition between fishers within fisheries is also mentioned by quite a few. Infrastructure is also a key issue. And here, landing and access to landing and landing processing and fish processing sites mentioned by many, and also ports, good ports. For economy, many mentioned the high costs of fish quotas and fishing vessels as a major challenge, and also the cost or the resource price, the price of marine resources. For workforce, recruitment was the main topic, really. I also just wanted to mention that our data set also includes information on indigenous fisheries. So we had 78 people, fishers, responding and claiming and saying that they're of Sami and Kvan ethnicity. And these people have most ties to the northernmost municipalities. They use handheld tools and they use smaller fishing vessels. So this just shows the importance of small-scale fisheries for indigenous fishers. The way forward now is really just to analyze the survey data even further using statistical analysis and latent variable modeling, and to explore within fisheries differences, whether or not there is an effect of gender, ethnicity, age on perceptions of justice. We also want to extend this work to aquaculture and tourism. So we're developing a survey that is going to go out to actors employed in aquaculture and tourism. And we will also potentially repeat the fishers survey to assess any temporal changes in perceptions. Finally, I just wanted to mention a related project, which is the Coastal Barometer, where we have developed information indicators, 9 indicators for sustainability goals in coastal communities in northern Norway. So I encourage all of you to go into kystbarometer.no, which is our platform where we present data and knowledge on sustainability related to coastal communities in northern Norway. So that was it for me. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, just contact me on email and I'll be happy to reply to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sigrid. This were some insights from Coast Shift project and related projects, Coastal Barometer. So Sigrid will not be in the panel today, but as she said, you can email her any questions and also contact us if you have any questions. The next on the list is Gerbel. Do we have Gerbel? Yeah. So Gerbel will be presenting some findings from another big project on Arctic development called Arctic Hubs.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Am I supposed to share my presentation or?
Gerbel, you need to share the screen or the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not allowed to share it. I think I need, it's disabled for me. Mm. Awesome. Thanks. So yeah, thank you for everyone for joining in this session. And so I'm Gerbel Ilumina. I'm from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. And in behalf of my co-authors and also my project partners in the Arctic Hubs project, I'm here to present to you our study in exploring local people's perspective on Arctic development using Q method. So I'm gonna just go dive. Okay, next slide. Yeah, dive right into our research question, which is how do local people perceive the current development of economic activities in the Arctic? And by economic activities, I mean fish farming, forestry, mining, tourism, and indigenous people's activities like reindeer herding or reindeer husbandry, and also traditional fishing. So next slide, please. And so, why do we ask this question? It's because we want local voices to be heard, which is one of the main objectives of the Arctic Hubs project. And well, my colleague Helge later on will discuss more about the objectives of the project and the details of it. So I'm just gonna breeze through with it as one of our reasons why we are conducting this study. So in the next slide, you can see our study sites. Could you next slide, please? Yeah. So these are also the Arctic Hubs project study sites, and the study is being conducted in 6 European Arctic countries and in 15 sites, as you can see on the map on the left. And we also have learning cases in Austria and in Italy, which is why I'm also in this project. And so for the Q method or the perception study that we are doing, we are conducting it in the Arctic. And by Arctic, we mean the 6 European countries, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And also we selected 6 project sites. Could you, next slide. Yeah, we selected the 6 project sites of all the Arctic hubs or nodes in the area. But for this presentation, since we're still doing data collection, I would present to you the Arctic level and also 3 results from 3 project sites, which is in Finland, Sweden, and Iceland. Next slide, please. So, in order for us to determine their perspective of the local people with regards to the Arctic development, we conducted the Q methodology, which is basically a mixed method to study objectively the subjectivity of a person, or just basically their opinions and beliefs. And in this case, with regards to Arctic development. So there are 5 steps in how to do it, but I will not go through each of those, but at the very gist of it, we conducted in-depth interviews and also conducted an online survey wherein participants rank and sorted statements to come up with the initial results that will be presenting you. So for in the next slide, please. So for our initial results, we derived a group of perspectives on Arctic development. And can you just press to show all the perspectives? Yes. Yep, continue. Just continue. So for the Arctic level, so these are the 6 European countries, we asked state representatives, NGOs, and also researchers at this level. And we were able to derive that there are 2 kinds of perspectives in the area, in the region itself. And one is advocates believe that industries aim to maximize profits. This is even at the detriment of the environment and culture in the Arctic region. Here, our advocates believe that green transition could be called dark transition, particularly for the indigenous people. And for the second group of perspective, here advocates believe in better national to local policy integration with regards to land use policies, expansion, and operation of industries. And this one is the opposite of the first perspective, because they see green transition as an opportunity rather than a threat. So now looking on the local level, the perspectives that we found at the local level, could you press the next graphics, please? Yeah. So Gällivare is a municipality in Sweden, in northern Sweden, and we found 3 perspectives in this area. Just press it, please. So we found that there is a group of people who are ambivalent to growth, which means they have opposing statements when it comes to the development of their area. What we found is they acknowledge both the positive and the negative side of the industries, of the economic activities, particularly here mining, because it is what it is, and there's nothing they could do more about it. And then the other one is what we call the perspective on reindeers first. So here, advocates see that when we prioritize reindeer, nature protection, biodiversity, improved culture, particularly for the Sami, and also human well-being will follow, because when you prioritize reindeer, you prioritize the nature. So that's the idea behind this perspective. The next one is a group of people who believe that community growth is equivalent to industry growth. And here, the advocates are very dependent on the industries and the operation and expansion of the industries. And they're really just pro-development in this case. And now looking at Kittilä, which is a site in Finland. Just press, please. So we found 2 group of perspectives here, which is just green transition. And here, advocates believe that consumption patterns should change rather than being used to justify the increasing demand for resources and the development and expansion of industries. So here, they also believe in development, but it has to be in a sustainable way as how they defined it. And next one would be also the same almost as Gällivare, wherein advocates believe that the community benefits from the industries. They believe that the industries support the development of their area because it brings jobs, income, and all the economic benefits that comes with it. For the last hub that we looked into, which is Westfjords in Iceland, so we found 2 almost the same perspectives. I just press on, and here you see that there's like almost the same, but the first one is looking at more local infrastructure development. And for them, Arctic development means infrastructure, ports, basically improved ports, tourism recreation areas, the roads, recreation buildings, to see that there is actual development. And the other one is more into enabling community growth. So looking at more inclusive decision making, transparent processes, and more inclusivity of different actors when it comes to deciding on policies or guidelines in the area. So if you press, so these are the number of participants in each area, and the dots is the industries in focus or economic activities in focus. So here we also looked into what is common between them, among them, and what is different between them. So if you press the next one, we see a pattern in such a way that the local hubs see that Arctic development means community development. So when they see that the benefits accrue to them directly, then it means this is development. And also, what we find that is also related when you press the next button uh, is that even though these three perspectives that you see that are connected by the broken line, they are named differently, but at the very core of it, it's they have um, care for nature concern. They have a concern for nature. So these are the perspectives that we see. So we also have in the next slide. Yeah, next slide, please. So we also look at the similarities and differences of these perspectives and when or how they are present. And these are just initial results and still have to undergo a lot more discussions and feedback. But what we found the same for all of them is that all these perspectives are actually for development. I think this is very important matter to say, because there is no one that we talked to that said we should stop development, but there should just be a just development. And as I mentioned earlier, so local hubs and communities should benefit more in all the development and operations of their areas in the Arctic, and as well as this, we see the commonality of the care for nature perspective in Arctic, Gällivare, and the Kittilä. And one more thing that is discussed in all these interviews and online survey is that green transition has increased the demand for resources, but these are felt differently by different actors. And when it comes to the differences, we see that the local benefits are more warranted depending on the context or economic status of the area. So if you remember earlier, Westfjords is almost into just pro-development, but we have to understand that Westfjords when it comes to fish farming and tourism, that industry is not yet much developed as compared to Sweden and Finland. And so for their perspective, development in terms of infrastructure, enabling community growth is much more prioritized rather than any other perspective. And so we also have different underlying reasons for nature protection, as this in Gällivare, where the reindeer should come first and everything would follow. And also it's that the Arctic region focuses on the policy and institutions, as where the local hubs or the municipalities is more focused on their self-sufficiency. And in my last slide, can you, just for the final discussion points, and the next slide, please. So what we found is that all perspectives agree to develop, but how to develop differs because they have different interpretations of what development is. And this, we could have a lot more information on how they develop based on the interview results that we would still have to focus on and dig more and deeper into this. And that, so as I said repeatedly earlier, that locals agree that benefits should accrue to them first, so as we can say that Arctic is developed, and that green transition is contested and felt differently by different actors in such a way that for Sami people that we have interviewed and we have talked to, they say it's green transition is differently because it encroaches upon their land, while green transition is very good for other perspective, like industry perspective, because it's a way for them to expand and operate more. And the picture that you see on the right, this is how the queue sorting or the data collection has happened. So that's all for me today. And if you have further questions, comments and questions is very much welcome. Feedback as well. And if you have further questions, you can send me a message in that email. And also, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Gerbal. The weather is better now, so we hope to see you soon in Tromsø. And thank you very much for the technical team bringing both speakers online smoothly. The next speaker we have is presenting personally. It's Anita Parlow from Fulbright Association, and she will present on empowerment, democracy, and indigenous sovereignty in the Arctic.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Jen Turtonton, who has brought me all the way through, and to the panel, online or off, and to Anu Fredriksson, who puts this remarkable gathering together, and to Arctic Frontiers, which is, to me, quite extraordinary. Do I do the slides? How do I? Do you all do the slides?
No, you do it. Press next.
Oh, next. Okay, my slides are not correlated with my remarks. They're more backdrop information, and I will try to keep up with doing both tasks simultaneously. Might I note, first, Finland, Canada, and I will be reading my remarks, so I apologize for that. Finland, Canada, Iceland, Greenland, through Denmark, and the United States have much in common as financially developed liberal democracies. In the Arctic regions, all of the resource-rich, sparsely populated region is experiencing substantial growth, as we've been hearing and discussing, given climate change with a focus on oil, gas mining, and shipping in the northern frontiers. Another commonality is that all, less Greenland, are colonial nations that, as is well understood, colonized native peoples with whom they made contact in the high north, who live in its harsh yet vulnerable environment for tens of thousands of years as independent peoples. What followed were centuries of land and ocean grabs, genocide, intentional destruction in the US, intentional destruction of language, culture, spirituality, and food security, amongst others. As is well understood, this historic shame is not yet over, despite progress being made, which will be discussed. Continuing with the colonizing societies' judicially sanctioned legal theories, such as in the United States, domestic dependent nation status in the United States courts, which, like the rest of the Arctic nations, absorbed indigenous peoples, nations without their consent. The larger colonial project in the High North designated Native peoples as objects of domestic and international law objects rather than subjects of law within their own sovereign space, legally able to articulate and exercise their own rights. What some have called empires of uniformity that legitimated and sustains both law and policy to force a continued acquiescence to dominant culture systems that Native peoples generally did not create, although we will be discussing more and more about empowerment. Writer Linda Tuulahawi Smith said of her observations, "The objective is to force us to lose ourselves entirely." Smith noted that every legal and political step offers a choice: relinquish agency, assimilate, or die by 1,000 cuts. So the question is the subject for this the question that is the subject for this panel, Empowering Arctic Citizens for Involvement in Decision-Making, asks if democratization is meaningful in the High North without greater implementation of the legal, political, and cultural protections to indigenous priorities as sovereigns. And if not, in the main, many posit the increasingly effective advocacy by Native peoples Arctic-wide is to achieve legal and political security of Aboriginal homelands and continue with thousands of years of stewardship in which the individual and the peoples, the tribe, the collective, does not conceptually or practically separate the self from the entire ecosystem on the lands and oceans customarily used for economic, cultural, or spiritual purpose. For the larger project to be able to continue to put food on the table, for the larger project. Over the past several decades, Indigenous legal and political initiatives, both in the High North and worldwide, have driven an international agenda that has expanded the generally agreed upon limits of sovereignty in the domestic legal sphere. The initiatives have been called green shoots of a global reconfiguration regarding tribal sovereignty. The advances in international law, considerable, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, that the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand initially refused to ratify, opposing the articles that affirmed Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination as potentially undermining their own sovereignty. In a non-Arctic Indigenous context in 1923, New Zealand's Maoris and US-based Haudenosaunee, whose philosophical principles helped shape some of the democratic concepts enshrined in the US Constitution, launched an initiative to bring ongoing abuses by colonizing states to the attention of the League of Nations, the precursor, as we know, to the UN for redress. Decades later, in 1982, following nonstop advocacy, the UN's Economic Social Council responded by establishing the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples that eventually led to the 2007 resolution regarding the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, criticized for lacking legal teeth, but did identify protection of what remains mainly aspirational rights of self-determination, the right to be protected from forced assimilation, the right to self-governance, and land rights ranging from ownership to environmental protections. Arctic-wide Indigenous organizations such as the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, as Jessica Shadian expressed in her dissertation, the ICC acknowledges the primacy of the nation-state and generally restricts its protections, but a nation-state that generally restricts its protections to individual rights and the right to assimilate, but protection of collective rights to choose assimilation or not requires a transcendence of the Westphalian model into a, quote, more fluid and complex construct, but vital if Indigenous rights are to be meaningfully protected in law and policy. Challenges to what is effectively a collision of cosmologies is visible in the vital area of food sovereignty. In the past several decades, Indigenous advocacy has reflected both the inseparability of individuals and the collective and has given rise to legally cognizable rights of nature, biodiversity, and the sacred place that binds the health of all living beings, which gave and gives rise to systems of governance, spiritual recognitions, and literally thousands of years of place-specific science, often with general applicability. Indeed, not all Native peoples live in a subsistence context. For example, Alaska Native corporations count amongst the most effective developers of oil, gas, and mining activities. It is also the case that many members of the same tribes practice and work hard to implement economies that draw from the subsistence practices of the past thousands of years, and are fighting hard at state, federal, and international levels to continue to so do. Perhaps amongst the most challenging core issues that require greater traction on the litigation and advocacy agenda is the issue of food sovereignty, particularly in the Arctic oceans and seas, with a right to subsistence fishing, walrus and seal hunting, and whaling at risk. In 2019, Native Alaskans organized a food sovereignty summit in Nome on the Alaskan mainland. The summit members, attended by representatives of nearly 100 of the Nome region Alaskan Native communities, discussed the tangible effects by global warming combined with increased commerce, oil, gas mining, commercial fishing, and shipping. Delegates described birds falling off cliffs from starvation as their food supply, fish, move northward seeking colder waters. The walrus and seals are getting skinnier, someone said. The shorter ice season and thinner ice makes it harder to butcher the whales on no longer frozen ice platforms, harder for walrus to mate with an ice platform gone, and harder for the fishers and whalers to get back home on small whaling boats as the ice may break up during the course of a hunt to put food on the table. Indigenous sovereignty is ultimately about power and rights, the ability to make changes that may require a redefinition of the terms of engagement between the larger societies of the colonial nations and Native peoples who are challenging continuing and contemporary acts of colonization to reverse the legal status of conquered to one of a meaningful inclusiveness into the broader polity. And our previous speaker mentioned about Indigenous communities and fishing in particular. As a matter of democratic process, what is measured, who sets the priorities, and whose values count? Are core questions. Complementary to food sovereignty is the question of Indigenous data sovereignty. Whose priorities count? What is measured? And what level of information exclusion, whether or not intended, sets policy? A general indigenous view across the Arctic and beyond, as I see it, is that, as a non-indigenous person, is that the human is not a species whose role is to dominate the planet's plant, animal, mammal, fish, and mineral life for its exclusive purpose. The human is just one component of an integrated ecosystem, both terrestrial and ocean, with a responsibility to maintain a balance. And the Hopi Way to the south in the US, Kionaskatsi, means life out of balance. Advocacy by indigenous peoples, organizations, and tribes, while ushering in a series of treaties, international agreements, and policies to ensure balance, acknowledge both collective and individual rights with an emphasis on self-determination and meaningful participation in decision-making, a proverbial seat at the table as equals would appear a significant step forward, and it is. But enormous challenges continue to exist. Some critics have called form of colonialism the seeming participatory process involved in decision-making, but not setting the agenda. Curbed by legal constraints such as domestic-dependent nations, a lesser seat at the table when such rights as subsistence, fishing, hunting, and whaling are at risk, or when protected areas whether ocean or land impede subsistence, fishing, reindeer herding, or the right to determine what may or may not occur on or in proximity to traditionally held and protected lands, requires an approach that recognizes indigenous sovereignty, stewards of lands from which the people view as a part of their individual and collective beings. The ocean is part of us, a Siberian Yupik whale hunter from Savunga said. Indigenous science of tens of thousands of years posits that interlinked and symbiotic relationship from the microscopic to the mammal, fish, and human. We take care of the beings in the national world, and they take care of us. The victories are significant as sovereignty encompasses a combination of legal, social, economic, political, cultural, and land rights. Sovereignty includes a combination of reversing continued experiences of colonialism, formulating rights to give meaning to sovereignty in the context of a dominant culture and its laws, to support local initiatives, as has been discussed, to protect ancestral lands, resources, self-governance, that indigenous priorities shape the policies under the meaning of self-determination. Democratization would have no consent until conditions of consent are realized. And the reason, so I should finish, as yesterday's remarkable seminar conducted at the UIT Peace Center, hosted by Gunhild Huggensen Gjorv and Whitney Lackenbauer, one participant noted in a conversation that a growing number of people believe that indigenous peoples form an Arctic League of Nations. To wait for others to acknowledge sovereignty and rights might be too late. If not sounding too apocalyptic in a time when the rules-based order is being challenged and appears to be heading into the Arctic, it does appear to make sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. The next speaker is also from Arctic Hub's project, Helge Flick, who will present on experiences from applying the DPSIR framework to 18 locations in the Nordic Arctic. Please.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Indeed, I'm another Arctic Hub's colleague. My name is Helge Flick, and I'm working for NORTH, more specifically the Department for Sustainable Regional Development in the Arctic. And today's presentation will be about our experiences from applying the driver pressure state impact response model, shortly DPSIR, to 18 locations in the Arctic. So as you all know, the Arctic region shares an identity of environmental beauty and cultural uniqueness. But in contrast, it is also characterized by continuous competitions for natural resources, and the opening of new economic sectors is driving, or has driven and is still driving, land-use conflicts between several industries and livelihoods. And of course, this produces transformations on Arctic nature, lives, and communities on several scales. In response, the Arctic Hubs project, with its slogan, Global Drivers, Local Consequences, develops and uses co-creative tools to reconcile competing land use modes and livelihoods whilst respecting the needs and the cultures of local populations. And here, the project focuses on 18 different hubs, Arctic hubs. And an Arctic hub, we heard it before in the presentation, but I will fast say it again. An Arctic hub can be defined as a geographic node or place that hosts either one or a combination of industrial activities or means of livelihood where challenges facing the Arctic are tangible and acute. And here, when we speak about industrial activities and impacts, there is a main focus on 5 key industries in the Arctic, which are forestry, aquaculture, mining, tourism, and indigenous activities, such as, for example, reindeer herding. And on the right, we can see all these Arctic hubs again distributed over the Nordic Arctic and beyond. So 18 hubs. That raises the question, how to analyze complex challenges in 18 hubs while keeping the same way of understanding challenges. And this brings us to the topic of this presentation, the Driver Pressure State Impact Response Framework, shortly DPSIR. The DPSIR model was originally developed from the European Environment Agency in the late 1990s, among other actors. And it was originally developed as an environmental assessment tool. And so the DPSIR describes a causal relationship between different parameters. And here we start with local drivers, drivers that can be local or global. And drivers can be explained as fundamental processes or developments in societies. Here we can think of changing lifestyles of societies, changing patterns of consumption or production. We can even think of the call for renewable energies, and we can even think of climate change. And these developments trigger certain economic activities. They enhance them. And this comes often with pressures. Pressures we can think of pollution or emissions. This, again, leads to a changing state of the environment. Here we can think of changing qualities of air, water, or soil. We can also think of the ecosystem functioning, biodiversity quality, and this, again, has an impact. And this impact has often a more social economic connotation. So, for example, overall, we can think of ecosystem services, health, and the economic impacts that inhabits. And in the end, we try to find responses to all these developments. And we have used the DPSIR model for all the 18 hubs to map economic activities and their impacts from several sectors, to assess the resulting changes coming with them, and to draft political and managerial reactions to these developments. This is how it looks in practice. So these are the DPSIRs that have been made with a software called the Banksia Decision Explorer. And all these vertical, let's call it pillars, they represent the different parameters in the DPSIR framework. And the first impression is some of these DPSIRs are rather okay to understand. They are quite on point, while other DPSIRs, for example, this one, or maybe this one, look like they have been laying on the attic for decades. Like spider webs, they are quite overused. And as these DPSIRs have been built collaboratively and interactively, we would like to ask the question, also dedicated to this session about participation, how can the framework be used as a communication tool or as a communication and participation platform to draw conclusions about environmental problems exerted by Arctic industries? The first question is, well, in such a context, why to choose the DPSIR framework? The DPSIR framework has proven itself as an illustrative toolkit that can structure a lot of impact data, and really a lot, from many locations. that face similar challenges. But more importantly, it also provides a shared understanding of parameter definitions like the drivers, the pressures up to the responses, and their causal relationships between them. And here I like to talk about the DIPSIA language, because the DIPSIA language is something that everybody can learn. When you have a big crowd in a room that is somehow involved in the same environmental problem, and you find a common vocabulary or a terminology of all these parameters, you instantly have a facilitator for discussions and a way more efficient communication. And also the a bit static it's not going back. Okay. The a bit static appearance of the DIPSIA allows also great for comparison and analysis. Yeah. So to shortly make you understand what we actually did in practice, I fast summarize how we actually applied the DIPSIA to the project. So first of all, we identified the most relevant hub representatives in our project. So that means every individual hub had an expert or several experts that were rooted in this hub, and that was our kind of link to these hubs. And then we used a data collection guide to assess environmental impacts as a result of hub-specific economic activities. And the result was a huge compilation of environmental impact data. And this we processed with the DIPSIA framework as I have shown it. And this happened in collaboration with all these hub experts via feedback sessions, bilateral meetings, and dialogue meetings with all the hubs. We also had DIPSIA workshops, for example, during our annual meetings. And here we tested the DIPSIA framework in bigger groups. And we also had a DIPSIA expert group with people very experienced in DIPSIA, with year-long experience. And here we could come back to when there were methodological or theoretical questions. These are my last slides now, some reflections about advantages and challenges. So advantages are definitely the DIPSIA has succeeded in processing and structuring impact data in great detail. They opened up interaction between global and local perspectives, because when we think of the drivers, the cause of environmental problems can be local, but they can also be global, and that can be negotiated in this framework as well. Then the template, the parameters, using the same ones, improves comparison and analysis, but there are definitely also some challenges. One is for sure complexity, because it is sometimes hard to identify the individual causal links in the vast amount of data. That is what I called the DIPSIA that is lying on the attic for so long. And also, not all the hubs have a homogeneous staff that is providing relevant data. So some hubs may have a bit fewer experts or a smaller network already in place, while others have it already existent. And this is my last slide. So we still have to go a way forward. We still have to do some follow-up rounds with all these DIPSIAs. So by the way, the DIPSIAs I showed you before, like all these little illustrations, that was just 1/3 of all the DIPSIAs we made. And still some data has to be followed up, and some frameworks have to be simplified. We have to secure the homogeneity of the way the hubs provide data. We still do a big synthesis of all the Arctic hubs frameworks. That means they shall, of course, inform decision makers and politicians as well. And how can we make them more to the point? That will happen in spring. We also will publish our experiences in the near future. And the last takeaway is basically, when all this is done, we for sure will need the DIPSIA 2.0. Because now we have all these data, about 18 hubs, and we cover a huge geographic area with this. But still, we can expand this So the Arctic is, of course, bigger than that still. And it would be very interesting to use the deep sea also for the remaining environments. So, and then to see, do they have the same problems like us? Do we have do they have other communication problems maybe? And that would also include to widen the repertoire of actors that can, in the end, contribute to the Deep Sea Framework. Because, of course, Arctic Hubs is a research project, and it would be in the future great to have also more public voices and private voices that can contribute to the Deep Sea Framework, especially when it comes to local places. And I think Deep Sea 2.0 is my most important takeaway. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
You're not allowed to go because we will have a panel.
Oh, I'm part of the panel.
Of course, you're part of the panel.
Okay.
You sit there.
All right.
And we have a small but very strong panel, Anita. The other girls escaped, but we will try to make up for that. Before we open for questions from the audience, which I hope are a lot, just to open the conversation, I would like to ask both of you, just in general, in this in your research and studies of the Arctic, and when it comes to empowerment of local people, do you see more generally, is there something very special about the Arctic in this sense, or it is all the problems or concerns are similar to other regions where we have kind of small communities or indigenous people? What do you think about that? Maybe Anita, you can start.
May I say, my work is qualitative rather than quantitative. So
I think you need to use the microphone. Just keep it to your mouth.
just keep it close. Is this better? My sense, it's a good question indeed. There is certainly something particular and specific about Arctic. I would make an analogy to the equator. The region I've worked in the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and a little bit Arctic. And when there is an environment, meaning terrain, temperature, a combination of things that is so dominating, so present, with such a personality in so many ways, it has an impact naturally on the human of the species who are living in those areas. And my sense is that because of the conditions, that people are more connected to each other, more aware of relationships, more caring about relationships, and more connected to the larger environment as well, which is similar, in my experience, to the equator in a different way. So yes, I think there are, and I think, without getting too carried away about it, but I was a Fulbright scholar in Iceland for a year, and my sense is that the not only the sense of connectivity, but the sense of advancing or moving forward or identifying and achieving objectives that is more profound and pronounced than perhaps in other kinds of contexts. And this is whether indigenous or not. So that is my sense.
Thank you. Helge?
Yeah, I think here I would like to come back again to these drivers I was talking about. So we have global drivers and local drivers who, in the end, trigger certain economic activities and as a causal chain, environmental problems. So the global drivers are drivers that are influencing the Arctic usually as a whole. For example, climate change. In the Arctic Hubs project, we had a whole working package dedicated to global drivers. So this can also be certain industry trends, social transformations, and so on. But there are also those local drivers. So every hub, for example, has its own little microcosmos, we can maybe call it. So there are certain environmental problems or social problems lie maybe in the community or in the local industry because they make certain decisions. So this, of course, then is a bit separated from global drivers. So I think in the end, it is also about interacting between those perspectives and finding something that negotiates between them, because it cannot always be fully global, it cannot always be fully local. And I think these local perspectives, they are indeed often different in all these Arctic locations. And I think we could dive into this and we could talk about this for 5 hours. And
Please do.
If I may follow up
Okay.
on that.
okay, I will stop the time.
Sorry.
No, oh good.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think that
It's the
was-
panel. You can talk. Yeah.
Oh, to follow up on your point, your very good point, is it seems to me that some of the dynamic that is happening in the Arctic region is exactly that tension, the difference between locally driven, locally determined commercial activity and that which comes externally, large-scale mining, oil, gas mining, kinds of shipping even. The question, of course, is how much do local communities get to control the external commercial dynamics as this tension is growing and will continue to unfold as the sea ice melts, the ice melts, and there's more access, more commercial access. On the one hand, the second part, I think several people might have mentioned, is the environmental climate folks who have, in many instances, very good concepts, but sometimes are implemented in regions like reindeer herders, for example, in which there is an enormous impediment to the ability of people to continue to live in a subsistence way of life. So these tensions are enormous, and as if one looks in other parts of the world, to your point, one can see destruction of entire communities or entire ways of life as a result. And as someone once said to me, who's in a ministerial position in Norway, he said, well, when you look in many of the other parts of the world where these kinds of dynamics and tensions exist, he said, we have kind of a far stronger rule of law. And I think that's true. And so then the question becomes, to your point, how are the priorities determined?
Oh, we have a question. There will be microphone.
Thank you so much, Anita, for a lot of the points that you brought up in your presentation. I work with an Indigenous development corporation in the Yukon in Canada. And within the Canadian Arctic context, we have a lot more codified voices of Indigenous peoples within development. And last week, Nunavut just went through its devolution. And so the involvement in decision-making is by law. There's no informed duty to consult. But within the Nordic Arctic context, what is that relationship between development and the Indigenous peoples of their land? Is it a duty to consult through just good governance, or is it codified that they need to be meaningful, authentic partners within development projects?
Good question. It depends upon the state's ratification of the treaties or agreements that have been made. So whether there has been ratification or not is kind of step one. It's almost a circle. The advocacy began from Indigenous communities, moved to the UN, and then the state must ratify. And I guess every context really is different. If there's, I would say, two generalities. One is they're insufficient, and two is there's an awful lot of movement, forward movement on the part of Native peoples to strengthen both international and domestic law. And I think it's, in a sense, what it seems to me is that there is potentially a redefinition of what sovereignty means and this is not, I mean, from time of Westphalian, agreements of what does sovereignty mean, to date, there certainly have been shifts. And if you look at transnational corporations and the extent to which around the world there are impacts on local national governments as a result of transnational economic activity, we've seen changes. It just sort of doesn't get called that. So this is a more sort of conscious way of equalizing and looking to the development of rights. My personal sense is that I feel, on the one hand, heartened, and on the other hand, worried. And I think we're in a very fluid moment, and the idea of being receptive to changed meanings of what is sovereignty is where we are.
Yeah, and I also think, especially in the Nordic countries, there are these Sami parliaments, like in Norway, Sweden, I think Finland has also one. I think this is also quite unique because that ties them also together. I think this kind of concept and structure you don't have so much in other areas, I think. I'm not researching so much on this topic, but that was a point that I was also thinking about. I think that is something that makes the Nordic Arctic quite strong in this regard.
The questions there? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Kathy Dunlop from the Institute of Marine Research here in Norway. It's been really good to hear about the Arctic Hubs project. I work with Sigrid on the Coast Shift project, which is one of these large FRAM programs set up 2 years ago. We're also working with a DIPSEER form of risk assessment to look at impacts from coastal food systems. And I see some of the same challenges that you discussed, having this complex assessment with lots of data coming from many different places, and how to communicate that to users and local communities. So it's good to make that contact first, but I'd like to hear if you have any experiences so far of trying to describe the DIPSEER method or your results to local communities or stakeholders.
Yeah, so the thing is, it is pretty much all integrated. So in the methodology, we decided to first look a bit what is actually out there when we talk about environmental problems and environmental assessments. So that is why we used this data collection guide first, that we also adjusted to the DIPSEER framework. And this already brought in all those data that there was, like a big overview. And then we took all this and brought it to the hub experts and then making sense of it and structure it in the DIPSEER model. So, and I think in the end, there are many different approaches you can make. So you could also argue, okay, let's first just meet in a room with 20 people who have the who represent several sectors or perspectives, and let's just start from zero. Let's first map the things, what comes to mind, how can we make sense of this. However, in a big research project like Arctic Hubs, it's also often about being time efficient, because you can often lose yourself in all these ongoing discussions. And that's why we first wanted to really have the hard facts, the data that we have, and then we made sense of them. And in this data collection, the hub experts were involved all the time, but also they had contact with their own networks. And that is also something I was talking about the homogeneity of the Arctic hubs, because that is something, it's a natural problem that this is different in the hubs as well. So some might have a bigger network, some might have a smaller network, or less data available, because some of these hubs are also very isolated, and that is a natural problem. And in the end, this brings us all, in the end, a huge data package with many perspectives, and then you have to make sense of it with everyone together in the project. And the results, they are really they are really, they go in different directions. That's also why we saw some deep seas that were a bit smaller, some deep seas that were quite big. Like some of these deep seas really, I think that we saw this one deep sea that looked like Spider-Man did it with all these interconnections. But there were even some deep seas that were even more intense than that. So yeah, it is in the end also about making this more clear and finding ways, what is the take-home message? And that is still something that will happen in spring. And I'm looking forward to share these experiences. So we should definitely connect on this topic.
There was another hand there.
Hi, Griffin Hill, Nord University, and I wanted to touch on something that the other Arctic Hub speaker mentioned about the contested nature of the green transition in a lot of these areas, and I was wondering what both of your thoughts were on that, of how investment, whether in time, space, or money for a lot of these groups that seem to have kind of done everything right in terms of sustainability for a long time, but still are faced with the costs of climate change and additional changes through the green transition. How do we sell this or make this worth their while?
Yeah.
Excellent question. It's, to me, the heart of the matter, or one of them. More thought, far more thought. Think before act. I've been writing about and investigating the last couple of number of months, maybe a year, deep seabed mining. And so green transition, we got to get off oil and gas, and so we're going to mine the deep seabed, also on land, terrestrial as well, but offshore, when nobody knows what the potential impacts are. Oh, we're just picking up nodules, they say. In fact, Norway is probably, and it's the country I would trust the most, is probably the most advanced, actually, both in thinking and practice in terms of deep seabed mining. My sense from the outside is that this is a way of shifting from oil, gas, offshore to another economic engagement that falls within what has been called green. And so first, in terms of something like deep seabed mining or such, which has potentially dramatic impact on the ecosystem in which the endeavor occurs, needs to be looked at over a period of however many years it takes to determine what the impacts actually are, both on the seabed itself, on the water column, and the larger accumulation of overlapping or proximity of such projects. So, and I would look at that far more broadly than just deep seabed mining. How does this transition work anyway? And on Svalbard, where I did spend some time, was looking at coal to green energy transition. There's also a hybrid war going on up there, but under kinetic with respect to Russia, in my view. And but what I found was extraordinarily interesting is in the shift from coal, and now diesel runs the power plant, and with idea of green water, wind, sun, and stuff that doesn't yet exist. The technology development that they're planning, Stornosky is planning, is extraordinary. And they've thought it through from the council local level in Oslo, at the national level, and the corporate folks, the local folks, which are very, as you know, transient folks, but Polar Science, they're top of the world, top class in terms of what they do. And I thought, wow, this is about as well thought out as anything I've seen. Not that I've seen it all, I have not. But certainly in the States, for example, there's no kind of thinking that integrates the pieces together. And whether it's a small project, relatively speaking, on Svalbard, and their thinking is that if it works in Svalbard, they're going to look at it Arctic-wide and their plans are to utilize whatever they can locally, including that which doesn't exist any longer. And should that occur, and I expect it will, and when it occurs, my guess is beyond Arctic and remote and rural regions anywhere in the world is what they'll be able to do. And so the question of green transition is certainly enormous, and to bring it back to the issue of indigenous rights, it just seems that something like, I don't remember, the World Bank said something like 80% of the protected lands on the planet are indigenous, either owned stewards of or in some legal or quasi-legal, shall we say, historical relationship too, and that's where there is the greenest. So it would seem that as equal seats at the table, speaking of sovereignty, is that how does that work? What are the questions? What are the dynamics? And apply 2,000 years of knowledge to today. It would seem sort of a piece, a significant piece of the puzzle. But mainly, bottom line is think it through. It's not just that we're going to make it green, so we're going to do deep seabed mining and get off of oil and gas. Great concept, but really, what are the impacts and the implications? Thank you for your question.
Helge, do you have anything to add?
Not really so much to that.
Was there questions there? Yeah.
Do you have another way of addressing it?
Hi, I'm Ina-Helena Alkvist from SINTEF Ocean. So you're talking a lot about like utilizing different types of knowledge and different communities in the Arctic. And that's why I had a question for you regarding the Arctic hubs. So I was wondering why you chose not to have fisheries as one of your stakeholder groups when you talk about important activities and communities in the Arctic.
That is a good question. So I remember that there were sometimes, even in the earlier beginnings of the project, these small misconceptions, like somebody was suddenly talking about fisheries, but then, yeah, but this is fisheries, this is aquaculture. I think the idea was that we originally wanted to have 5 key industries, and I think the reason in the end is rather simple, that we had to make a decision what to take, and then we decided for aquaculture, because it is so also distributed in the Arctic as well, in Norway especially.
Vigdis, why do we only have aquaculture, not fisheries?
Well, we do have fisheries as well.
We do have, yeah. I think it was also because the question there was how the newcomers, newcoming industries impacting the more traditional ones. So it was kind of aquaculture in how it impacts fisheries. In that sense, it was included. But I don't know how you did in the surveys.
It was taken as a bit younger industry.
Yeah.
But in the end, we wanted to have 5 industries.
Yeah. There was a question there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a nice discussion, Dieter Müller, Umeå University. It's also regarding the Arctic hubs, and you said there are kind of global drivers and local drivers. And my question to you would be, aren't we forgetting something in the middle? Regional drivers. And I think, at least if I consider the situation in northern Sweden, I think it's a lot of a regional discussion rather than kind of a local discussion. And also, it's a modern society. We have a highly modern society. And most people don't dwell only in one place. They dwell through different places. And they are citizens of a region rather than a village or a town. And I think, I would like to hear your comment on that. And the other thing that I am a little bit wondering about listening to both of you is in a way, when we talk about these kind of small communities, we in a way have a certain tendency to homogenize their population. I think you did that very nicely, showing the opposite with your kind of complex networks. But could you reflect a little bit about that as well? To what extent is this a reasonable idea, actually, that a community should have a voice in it, in kind of, or one voice, I should say, rather than being kind of a thrown together kind of agglomeration of different people with totally different aspirations, where some would like to drill a new hole in the ground, and others would like to avoid that. I mean, isn't that in a way the end of the day democracy and what we need to face in all kind of communities? Thank you.
So maybe first, the first question, I really like your comment because that is basically the result of the interaction between local drivers and global drivers. Because I think we can think of these drivers sometimes also as a scale. The scale that goes sometimes more near to global drivers, more near to local drivers. And in between, you have the regional drivers. So it is, of course, in the end, a matter of how you see the problem and how this arises in the discussion. So absolutely, regional drivers is for sure a great wording and would be fitting to many areas as well. And to your second question, I'm not sure if it sounds a bit like how you understood it, that the local voices were rather isolated in the data, or or maybe I understood it wrong.
No, not really. I mean, I think often when we talk about these kind of places, we homogenize them. We kind of assume that they should have one voice, that they are, that they should agree on things. In an urban setting, we would never expect people to agree.
Mm.
Actually, places where we have discourses about things and where we are not, kind of agreeing, are often the more vibrant ones, and we will celebrate that. But if we come to the kind of rural and peripheral places, we often expect, in a way, the opposite to happen. And that was a little bit what I was heading for, in a way.
I think what you're talking about, or part of what you're talking about, is a power imbalance. I mean, when one talks about relatively remote from urban areas or communities, particularly whether it's offshore or onshore mining or petroleum development, the power imbalances of a combination of the state and whether it's a domestic corporate interest or transnational is enormous. And the tendency, I think, to a question that was, points that were made earlier, is the tendency would be, okay, we're going to build a railroad. Do you want the tracks here or there? And it's not a question of do you want tracks, And so I think there's a general challenge and dilemma, if you will, in that context. And if I can bring it in also in the context of indigenous communities, of which many are remote from large urban settings, or if it's onshore or offshore or reindeer herding or what, is the best that seems to have emerged both in sort of an international context sometimes, and in some instances applied domestically as well, is the idea of, well, there's Western science and there's indigenous knowledge. And I mean, to me, that's ridiculous. You got 20,000 years of day-to-day observation, and it's not called science in an international context, and that also has to do with power imbalances. So one thing reinforces the other, and I think there's an unfolding and unraveling of that is occurring in terms of empowerment. There's a long way to go, but your points are well taken.
If I also may add a little bit, I think it's also a question of how to make, especially when it comes to surveys, how to make a representative sample, because it's in urban conditions where a lot of people in a city, you can kind of sample different opinions and different points of view, but it becomes challenging when you have a community where 100 people live, and this is, well, on the other hand, you can sample the whole population if you're lucky. So
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
How do you determine your questions?
Which questions?
The questions that you ask when you're engaging in your process. How do you determine what are the questions? And then how do you determine who are the people to whom you ask the questions? If I missed that, forgive me, I have a small brain, but...
Yeah, I think first it was really to get the data to see what is out there. So these were rather a bit more general, but adjusted to the needs of the DIPSIA framework. And then basically all the data was collected, and then there were the negotiations. What do we do with these data now? So the questions were like not very detailed. They didn't ask immediately for very quantitative data, but they had to grasp the most important whole. So that is what I can say about this. But I also wanted to first say one other thing, and that is so about not isolated voices, but the power imbalances. So that is also why we chose these 5 industries, because also the indigenous activities are an own industry. And that's why we put them in there, to also have those experts in there, so that they are in the same room with all the other actors. And I also want to add that what we did here, also all these diagrams, the frameworks, how they look now at the moment. This is actually something that we have done, or that has been done for the first time. So we used this framework for only the Arctic, for a really big geographical space. And we wanted to see where it brings us and how detailed the data will be, and how well negotiated the views on them can become. So it was also a little bit experimental. And the results could have also look very different, maybe under some other constellations within the hubs. So that is something that is, of course, always a natural development. But still, for that it was experimental. It is very it is astonishing what we see in these results, and how much they can also help in other geographical areas.
Do you find that as you go, the information and the data you get is more nuanced, that you get more complexities in interpretations and points of view and the dynamics?
Yeah, they do. So they get pretty nuanced. So we often have a little bit a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. Some hubs are like very direct in their data. They have exactly the numbers, while others have it a bit less. So yeah, and the further you go, the more often complex it becomes. But therefore, we also have, even as an own task in the whole working package where we work with the DIPSIR, an own synthesis task, where we now take all this and try to pack it into messages with which we can tackle the actual problems.
Thank you. And once you do that, do you then get feedback in terms of consensus on both process and outcome?
Yeah.
And so people say, we agree, we don't agree.
Absolutely.
Like we like the process. Is that it's an honest one?
Yeah. So it is always bilateral. It is always, we don't do it like alone. Yeah.
If I may have one more question. In the meetings I was honored really to attend yesterday at UIT, there were about 50% of the meeting was basically on Arctic-wide indigenous issues. And several people made the point that we don't trust the government, and whatever government's Arctic-wide, and the governments don't trust us. And so there's this big, huge trust gap. And so then a reluctance perhaps to give up information, to wonder what's going to happen, to not trust or believe the information. I mean, both ways, always. Is that something you've experienced, or how would you address it if that was the case?
So I must say that we have not really included so much governments. So that is also what I meant with homogeneity of the hubs that provide data. Some of them might have in the network certain people that maybe have experiences with working in the government, but most of them didn't have it. So some hubs had a rather more maybe scientific basis because it was just what was there, but others maybe had a big wider network and could have as a source such information. But in general, these were not perspectives that were possible to include in a practical way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you, everybody who came here today, and thank you again, technical team. Yes, and there will be other parts of this session, so you're all welcome later today, yes, and tomorrow. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much also, you too.